June 15th, 2009. Toronto, Ontario. 32-year-old Turkish immigrant Hatice Corbacioglu leaves on a road trip to New York in order to meet her 28-year-old Turkish boyfriend Riza Cosa, but she never returns and breaks off all contact with her family. Riza claims that Hatice left on a flight to Turkey, but it eventually comes out that Riza is married, and his 45-year-old wife, Winsome Angela Perez, has also gone missing. In May of 2010, Winsome's body is discovered behind Riza's former workplace, and it is reported that Riza returned to Turkey and took his own life, but no trace of Hatice is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and for the second consecutive week, we are going to be traveling back to our podcast's home country of Canada to cover an unsolved cold case, the 2009 disappearance of Hatice Corbacioglu. This story was once featured on an episode of the true crime TV series Disappeared, which was titled One Way Ticket, but while the show has aired for 11 seasons and produced over 140 episodes, I believe this is the only case they've ever featured involving a Canadian victim, though she technically went missing in the United States. And it also happens to be one of the show's more lesser known and least discussed disappearances. Hatice Corbacioglu was a Turkish immigrant who had spent over 15 years living with her family in Toronto and found herself involved in a long-distance relationship with a Turkish man named Riza Cosa, who lived in New York. Hatice frequently traveled across the border to visit Riza and hoped to eventually get married, but after driving to New York to meet him in June of 2009, she inexplicably vanished without a trace. While Hatice was planning to fly to Turkey in order to meet Riza's family and even purchased a plane ticket, there was no record of her ever having left the US after she arrived there. Alarm bells started going off when Hatice's family learned that Riza was already married to another woman named Winsome Angela Perez, who also happened to go missing shortly after Hatice disappeared. Several months later, Winsome's body would be found, and a homicide investigation was launched. But it wasn't long before the American authorities learned that Riza had returned to his native Turkey and killed himself. The most prominent theory was that Riza murdered both Winsome and Hatice before fleeing the country, but since Hatice's body has still never been found, Riza's suicide offered little comfort for her loved ones. In fact, given the limited information that has been shared by the Turkish authorities, Hatice's family have even considered the possibility that Riza may have staged his own suicide and is actually still alive somewhere. Given that this case involves jurisdictional red tape from no less than 3 different countries, it's been very difficult to turn up any conclusive answers, so we're going to do our best to try and piece this puzzle together on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Hatice Corbacioglu. Our story begins in Toronto, Ontario, Canada in 2009. Our central figure is 32-year-old Hatice Corbacioglu, who was originally born in Turkey, but emigrated to Toronto alongside many members of her extended family when she was 15. At this particular point, Hatice works as a forklift operator at a rubber factory and also holds down a second part-time job at a bakery. She has already been through 2 separate marriages to men from her original hometown, which were both arranged by her father, Winsome Corbacioglu, but they would each end in divorce. However, near the end of 2008, one of Hatice's male friends would attempt to set her up with his 28-year-old cousin, Riza Cosa. Riza was a Turkish refugee living in Hicksville, a hamlet located on Long Island in New York, and he worked as a welder at a company called Express Steel Supply. After Riza's cousin provided Hatice with his phone number, they proceeded to have a number of conversations and frequently exchanged texts and emails. Since she really seemed to hit it off with Riza, Hatice decided to take a road trip to New York alongside her best friend, Riza Cosa, so that she could finally meet Riza face-to-face and celebrate New Year's with him. They soon became involved in a serious long-distance relationship, and over the course of the next 6 months, Hatice would frequently cross the border and make the drive from Toronto to New York in order to visit Riza. She hoped to marry Riza, so a plan was made for Hatice to accompany him on a trip to Turkey in order to meet his parents and extended family for the first time. If things went well, the couple would get married following their return. On the morning of June the 15th, Hatice said goodbye to her father Yusuf in Toronto and told him she would likely be gone for a few weeks before she embarked on a road trip to New York in her brown 2007 Toyota Corolla. But unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time Hatice's loved ones ever heard from her. Even though it was common practice for Hatice to frequently keep in touch with her family whenever she went on these trips, 5 days passed without them hearing anything from her. On June the 20th, Yusuf finally started calling Hatice's cell phone, but she would not answer or return any of his calls. Hatice's best friend Navruz also kept calling her cell phone, but she could not get through or receive any response either. However, Yusuf eventually received a call from Riza, who claimed he was phoning from New York and had already sent Hatice on her flight to Turkey. Since Riza was a refugee, he said there were some problems with his paperwork allowing him to leave the country, so he was forced to stay behind. This temporarily quelled Yusuf's concerns, but even though Hatice had said her trip was supposed to last a few weeks, she never returned home and once again made no attempt to contact her family or friends. A full month and a half would pass without any word from Hatice, but on July the 31st, Yusuf received another phone call from Riza. He claimed that Hatice had returned to New York from her trip to Turkey, but after he went to John F. Kennedy International Airport to pick her up in her Toyota Corolla, Hatice informed him that she had changed her mind about getting married. They then got into a fight before Hatice drove off in her Corolla, leaving Riza behind at the airport. As a result, he was forced to walk home, but he claimed this was the last time he ever saw her. Yusuf initially believed Riza's story and figured that Hatice was feeling ashamed about another failed relationship, so she had decided to take off for a while to avoid facing her family. He hoped she would eventually resurface, but another 2 weeks passed following Riza's phone call, and Hatice still made no attempt to contact anyone and never answered her cell phone. Finally, on August the 13th, nearly 2 full months after she left on her trip, Hatice's family finally contacted the Toronto Police Service in order to officially report her missing. The police would soon confirm that Hatice's Corolla did drive across the Niagara Falls International Rainbow Bridge on June the 15th and cross the border into New York State. Since Riza lived in Long Island, which was under the jurisdiction of the Nassau County Police Department, the Toronto Police Service got in touch with them, but even though they checked out several addresses which were associated with Riza, including his residence in Hicksville, they were unable to turn up any trace of him or Hatice. Since there weren't any strong leads to work with, Yusuf decided to travel to New York in order to start posting and circulating missing persons flyers for his daughter. He paid a visit to the Turkish consulate in Manhattan and learned that Hatice had gone there on June the 18th, 3 days after she left Toronto, in order to change some of the information on her Turkish passport in preparation for her upcoming trip. Investigators did confirm that a plane ticket was purchased under Hatice's name at a local travel agency which serviced the Turkish community, and her flight to Turkey was scheduled to leave from JFK International Airport on June the 21st. However, a check of the passenger manifest for this flight confirmed that Hatice never boarded it and did not use her Turkish or Canadian passport to enter Turkey at any point. In fact, there was no record of Hatice having boarded any flights or crossed the border back into Canada, and since there was no activity on her bank accounts, cell phone, or Facebook account during the 2-month window she was missing, her digital trail had come to an end in New York. But oddly, Port Authority records show that on the afternoon of June the 21st, the day of Hatice's scheduled flight to Turkey, her Corolla had driven into one of the JFK airport parking lots and remained there for 1 hour and 20 minutes before it left. Unfortunately, since the airport only kept their video surveillance footage for 30 days before erasing it, and Hatice had been missing for 2 months at this point, no footage could be found to confirm if the car had been driven there that day by Hatice or someone else. To make things even stranger, it would turn out that over 1 month later, on July the 29th, Hatice's Corolla received a ticket for parking next to a fire hydrant at 315 East 92nd Street in the Yorkville neighborhood in Manhattan. The vehicle was eventually moved from that spot, but a check of all security cameras in the area failed to turn up any footage which may have showed who parked the car there and drove it away. But investigators noticed that at the time, Riza's place of employment, Express Steel Supply, had been doing a job at a work site near the location where the Corolla was parked. Well, a check into Riza's background would uncover a shocking revelation. He was already married to a 45-year-old woman named Winsome Angela Perez. And if that wasn't enough, it turned out that Winsome had also gone missing. Winsome had been employed as a personal banker at a Chase Bank branch in the Long Island hamlet of Wantagh, and the last time she was confirmed to be alive was when she was seen leaving her workplace at around 6 p.m. on July the 28th. When Winsome failed to return to work for the next 3 days and did not answer any phone calls from her coworkers, she was officially reported missing to the Nassau County Police Department on July the 31st. In an odd bit of timing, Hatice's Corolla had received its parking ticket the day after Winsome disappeared. The following day, July the 30th, records would show that Riza purchased a one-way plane ticket to Istanbul, Turkey at the same travel agency where Hatice had purchased her ticket. Riza made his final phone call to Yusuf the day after that, which happened to correspond with Winsome's co-workers reporting her missing, and Riza presumably boarded his flight to Istanbul a short time later. While Hatice's family were completely unaware that Riza was married, Hatice apparently did know this and had confided in her best friend, Navruz. When the Toronto Police Service interviewed Navruz, she claimed that Hatice had told her that Riza and Winsome were separated and would be divorcing sometime in the future, allowing Hatice and Riza to get married. Even though Hatice had made her family believe that her relationship was a happy one, she had painted a much darker and disturbing picture of Riza during her conversations with Navruz. Navruz told police that the couple fought all the time because Riza was very jealous and controlling, and did not like the fact that Hatice had a very independent, free-spirited personality. Things sometimes crossed the line into domestic violence, and there was one incident where Riza got so angry that he tied Hatice's hands behind her back with a belt and placed a bag over her head before he proceeded to torture her for the next 2 hours. In spite of this, Hatice was apparently convinced she could make the relationship work and still hoped to marry Riza. While the Nassau County Police Department handled the investigation into Winsome's disappearance, the Toronto Police Service tried to figure out what happened to Hatice. They hoped to track down and question Riza, but at the time, Canada did not have an international treaty with Turkey requiring the two countries to share information with each other, so they did not receive much cooperation from the Turkish authorities. However, they did manage to obtain Riza's new phone number in the city of Sivas, and since the Toronto Police Service employed a Turkish-speaking constable named Ahmet Demirden, he agreed to make an attempt to call Riza and question him. Even though Riza had no legal obligation to speak with law enforcement, he was described as being very cooperative and agreed to converse with Constable Demirden on numerous occasions. But when asked about the last time he saw Hatice, Riza provided a completely different story than the one he had shared during his final phone call with Yusuf. This time, instead of alleging that Hatice drove off on him at JFK Airport, Riza said that they got into a heated argument while driving through New York City after he learned that Hatice had received a message from another man on her cell phone. This sent Riza into such a rage that he took Hatice's phone and broke it, which prompted Hatice to end the relationship and leave him. Riza said that he was left so heartbroken by the whole situation that he soon decided to leave the United States and return to Turkey for a fresh start. Even though there were no records to indicate that Hatice left the country, Riza expressed his belief that Hatice had either returned to Canada, traveled to Turkey, or gone to visit a friend of hers in Saudi Arabia. When asked what happened to his missing wife, Winsome, Riza claimed that he had no idea, as he had broken off all contact with her when he left the country, but he theorized that Winsome may have traveled to Florida to visit her mother. According to Constable Demirden, Riza got very emotional when he talked about Hatice, but he also said that he quote-unquote loved Hatice to death in the past tense. During their final phone conversation, Riza accused Hatice of cheating on him and said to Demirden, quote, "Well, you're Turkish too, what would you do?" This prompted Demirden to ask Riza what he did to Hatice, but he simply responded by saying, quote, "Nothing," in a flat, unemotional voice. Demirden then asked Riza if he killed Hatice, and he once again replied that he did not, in a very unemotional voice before the call ended. Based on their conversations together, Demirden reached the conclusion that Riza was involved in Hatice's disappearance, but by the end of 2009, Riza had stopped answering his phone and communicating with law enforcement. Well, on November the 25th of that year, there would be another major development when Hatice's abandoned Toyota Corolla was finally discovered in a parking lot at JFK International Airport. As you recall, the Corolla had entered the parking lot 4 months earlier on June the 21st before it left that very same day, but the vehicle was apparently returned there at a later time. Even though the Toronto Police Service had asked the Port Authority to keep an eye out for the Corolla, an administrative error occurred in which the Port Authority mistakenly logged the vehicle's license plate under CA, which stood for Canada, instead of ONT, which stood for Toronto. As a result, the car was not discovered until November, at which point any surveillance footage which showed the vehicle being parked there had long been erased. The condition of the car seemed to indicate that it had been there for months, as some of the windows had been smashed out. The Corolla also seemed to be in complete disarray, as if someone had been searching through it. The trunk contained some cleaning supplies as well as traces of blood, and blood was also found on the driver's seat. As far as I know, the Nassau County Police Department did not perform DNA testing on the blood to determine who it belonged to. The investigation remained at a standstill for the next 5 months, but on May the 10th, 2010, the decomposed body of a woman was discovered in Long Island in the village of Westbury. The victim had been wrapped in a couple of layers of plastic before she was wedged in between a 40-foot steel storage container and a chain-link fence. She had likely been dead for several months, and an autopsy would determine that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. It wasn't long before the victim was identified as Winsome Angela Perez, and her body just happened to be found on the property for Riza's former employee, Express Steel Supply. Riza was immediately named as a person of interest in Winsome's murder, and for the first time, Hatice's disappearance and her connection to Riza received coverage in the American and Canadian media. I previously mentioned that at the time, Turkey and Canada did not have an international treaty which required the two countries to share information, but there was such a treaty between Turkey and the United States. As a result, the Turkish authorities were informed that Riza was wanted for questioning, and pressure was exerted to arrange for his extradition to the U.S. once he could be found. Interpol became involved in the investigation and spoke to Riza's family, who claimed they did not know his current whereabouts. But the whole story wound up receiving international coverage, as Riza's potential involvement in Winsome's murder and Hatice's disappearance was reported on by the Turkish media. Well, it wasn't long before North American authorities received word from Turkey that Riza had been found dead in Sivas. On May the 20th, Riza was killed after a fall from the 9th floor of his 10-story apartment building and his death was ruled to be a suicide, as he had left behind a note in which he wrote that the biggest mistake he ever made was getting involved with a Canadian woman. However, other than one crime scene photo of Riza's body being carried away from the scene on a stretcher, the North American authorities never received any further materials related to his death, such as documentation or additional photographs. They also never got the opportunity to view Riza's body or question any of his family members, friends, and acquaintances, though, according to the Turkish media, an autopsy was performed, and Riza was buried in a family plot. Well, Hatice's family was not entirely convinced that Riza's suicide was genuine, as they did not believe the body in the crime scene photo looked like him. They began to wonder if Riza might have killed another person in order to fake his own death, and after his family falsely identified the victim as being him, they proceeded to protect Riza by hiding him out somewhere. Winsome Corbacioglu wanted the Turkish authorities to perform a DNA test on Riza's body to positively confirm it was him, but this was never done. Yusuf also hired a private investigator to look into Riza's death, and even traveled to Turkey to circulate missing persons flyers for Hatice, but he did not obtain any useful new information. For their part, the Toronto Police Service found the staged suicide scenario to be unlikely. Riza was carrying identification with him when he was found, and one additional piece of evidence which convinced them that Riza's suicide was genuine was the fact that he was wearing Skechers men's shoes in the crime scene photo, and an empty shoebox for the specific brand, size, and color had been found inside Hatice's abandoned Corolla at JFK Airport. Since the Nassau County Police Department were convinced that Riza was responsible for Winsome's murder, they closed the investigation into her case. But even though Hatice technically went missing in New York, the Nassau County PD never officially opened an investigation into her disappearance, so Hatice's case would still be handled by the Toronto Police Service. The story received some national attention in December of 2012 when it was featured on an episode of Disappeared titled One Way Ticket, but it did not lead the authorities any closer to a resolution. Even though the Toronto Police Service had very few leads to work with, Hatice's case would remain open, and in April of 2019, shortly before the 10-year anniversary of her disappearance, they sent out a public plea for anyone to come forward if they had information. But after 15 years, no trace of Hatice Corbacioglu has ever been found, and she continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned during the intro, Hatice Corbacioglu is the only Canadian victim to ever be profiled on an episode of Disappeared, and her case seems to be one of the least discussed among fans of the show. The mainstream media attention surrounding Hatice's disappearance was very limited, as I don't believe her case got any exposure at all until May of 2010, shortly after the discovery of Winsome Angela Perez's body. The whole story seemed to completely disappear from the spotlight after law enforcement received word about Riza Cosa's death a few weeks later, and while it did attain some national exposure on Disappeared in 2012, it does not appear there have been any new developments in the investigation in quite some time. Since Hatice was a Canadian citizen, none of the law enforcement agencies in New York ever opened up an investigation into her disappearance, so it appears that the Toronto Police Service are the only ones still actively working on this. And there's really only so much they can do, since Hatice technically went missing on American soil. It's easy to forget that there are two victims in this story, as Winsome Angela Perez was brutally murdered, but unfortunately, other than the fact that she was married to Riza Cosa, virtually no information has been released about her background. When Winsome's body was found, it was reported that she had a son living in Jamaica at that time who was notified about her death, but I can only assume this child was from a previous relationship before she became involved with Riza. We have no idea how long Winsome and Riza had been together or what their relationship was like, but given that Riza was a Turkish refugee and there was a 16-year age difference between them, I have to wonder if perhaps he decided to marry Winsome for the purpose of obtaining a green card. I know that Riza supposedly told Hatice that he had already separated from Winsome before they met, but I have no idea if this is true. The issue is that none of Hatice's family ever got the opportunity to meet Riza face to face, as it sounds like the only other person that met him was Hatice's best friend, Navruz Achikos, who accompanied Hatice to New York for her first ever meetup with Riza in December of 2008. Navruz also seemed to be the only other person who knew about the domestic violence in the relationship and Riza's jealous and controlling behavior, and given what ultimately happened, I would not be surprised if he treated Winsome in the exact same way. I would certainly love to know more information about Riza's cousin, who was a friend of Hatice's and helped hook the couple up, as you would think the cousin would have been aware that Riza was already married. It sounds like Hatice just had the misfortune of falling in love with the wrong person, but while it's not hard to imagine what happened here, I suppose the big unanswered question is why Hatice's disappearance and Winsome's murder took place about a month apart. I previously made mention of the jurisdictional red tape in this case involving 3 separate countries, as we have a Canadian citizen who went missing in the United States, and the prime suspect died in Turkey. The Nassau County Police Department's investigation into Winsome's murder is officially considered to be closed, as they believe that Riza killed her, and since he went on to take his own life, they feel there's nothing more they can do. But of course, since Hatice's death has not been confirmed and her body has never been found, her case is a lot more complicated. While there's no paper trail to show that Hatice ever left the United States after she arrived in New York, her remains are most likely in the country somewhere, but where would you even start looking? Of course, another complication is that Hatice's family are not entirely convinced that Riza's so-called suicide was genuine, and believe that he could have faked his own death and might still be alive somewhere in Turkey to this day. That idea might seem far-fetched, but it's not unprecedented, as back in episode number 158, our podcast covered the story of Azat Abul Hulsen, a Lebanese national who seemingly managed to fake his own death in 1982 by killing an unidentified John Doe and leaving his body in the garage when he set fire to his house in Florida. This was supposedly done so that Azat's sister could collect on a substantial life insurance policy and he could return to his native Lebanon and use the insurance money to start a new life, and to this day, he has never been tracked down or caught. While the Toronto Police Service seemed to believe that Riza's suicide was legitimate, the only evidence that anyone in North America has seen is one solitary crime scene photo of Riza's body. Hatice's family said they did not believe that the deceased individual in the photo looked much like Riza, but you have to remember that they never actually met the guy in person and are only basing their memories of him off some other photographs that Hatice shared, which were taken about a year before Riza died. The disappeared episode does display the crime scene photo on screen, and it appears to be blurred out, likely because they didn't want to showcase a graphic image of a dead body on television, so of course, I couldn't judge if the victim looked like Riza or not. From what I could tell in the disappeared episode, after Hatice went missing, her family was taken by complete surprise when they learned that Riza was already married. It appears that the only person that Hatice confided in about this was Navruz, but she seemed to be under the impression that Riza and Winsome were separated and planning to divorce. Once again, we know so little about Riza and Winsome's relationship that I'm not sure if this is actually true, but it's very possible that Riza spent several months living some sort of double life until the whole house of cards came crashing down. But let's look at the timeline. The issue with figuring out what happened is that most of the details we know about Hatice and Riza's relationship were shared third hand, and while Hatice tried to paint the whole thing as idyllic to most people, Navruz painted a much darker picture involving domestic violence and torture. Given that Hatice had already gone through 2 divorces in marriages which were arranged by her father, I can understand her reluctance to open up about these issues with her own family, and it appears that in spite of Riza's violent side, she was really determined to make the whole thing work. Over the course of their 6-month relationship, Hatice drove from Toronto to New York to meet Riza numerous times, but due to his refugee status, I assume it wasn't possible for him to cross the border to visit her in Canada or leave the country at all. Hatice left on her final trip to New York on June the 15th, and the story goes that she was planning to fly to Turkey to meet Riza's family with hopes of marrying him once she returned. We know that Hatice was alive for at least 3 days after she arrived in New York, since it was confirmed that she went to the Turkish consulate on June the 18th to update her passport. During Hatice's previous trips to New York, she always kept in constant contact with her family and friends via phone, text, or email, so it is a bit odd that she would be there for 3 days without reaching out to them at least once. We know that Hatice would not answer or return any of the calls she received from her father on June the 20th, and it seems like before she boarded her scheduled flight to Turkey on the 21st, something went horribly wrong. Now, the weird thing is that Port Authority records show that Hatice's Corolla entered a parking lot at JFK Airport on the 21st, but she never actually boarded any flights, and the vehicle remained there for approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes that day before it left. It's never been conclusively established who drove the car there, but if Hatice was already dead by that point, I'm not sure why Riza would bother driving there for a limited amount of time. We know that the Corolla was found abandoned in the JFK parking lot 4 months later, but I'm not sure why it wasn't simply left there on June the 21st. The only explanation I can think of is perhaps Hatice and Riza drove to the parking lot together, but even though she had every intention of boarding her flight, something went wrong, such as an argument or a violent altercation. Theoretically, if Riza attacked or killed Hatice in the parking lot, he would have needed the Corolla to transport her away from the scene. But if this is what happened, why didn't Hatice take any of her father's calls or get in touch with him the previous day? And what happened to the Corolla after it left the airport? The whole situation is pretty confusing because we know that the car received a parking ticket on East 92nd Street on July the 29th before it later wound up back at JFK Airport, but if Riza killed Hatice, why would he keep her vehicle in his possession for over a month instead of getting rid of it? What's interesting is that Winsome was last confirmed to be alive on July the 28th, and the Corolla received the ticket 1 day later, at a location which was very close to a spot where Riza's employer was performing a job at that time. We know that traces of blood were found inside the trunk and on the driver's seat, though I do not believe DNA testing was ever performed to confirm who the blood actually belonged to. I'm not entirely sure if Riza owned his own vehicle, so I think there's a good chance that he murdered Winsome shortly after she returned home from work on the 28th, and then used the Corolla to transport Winsome's body before he dumped it at his place of employment, where it remained undiscovered for over 9 months. I think it's too much of a coincidence that Riza purchased his one-way plane ticket back to Istanbul on July the 30th, as he knew that he needed to skip the country and likely drove the Corolla to JFK Airport before he boarded his flight. It's also worth noting that Riza's final phone call to Winsome Corbacioglu occurred on July the 31st, where he claimed that he had gotten into a fight with Hatice at the airport after her return flight arrived from Turkey, as she told him that she no longer wanted to get married and took off. Riza likely did this to buy himself some time, but of course, we know this story is not true, since there was no record of Hatice ever having traveled to Turkey, and he shared an entirely different story about their so-called breakup when he spoke to Constable Ahmet Demirdin on the phone months later. It was certainly brazen of Riza to agree to speak to Demirdin on numerous occasions since he had no legal obligation to do so, but he was already in Turkey by that point and was narcissistic enough that he likely thought he was completely untouchable. While it's not hard to put together a timeline of when Riza killed Hatice and Winsome, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about the motive. Even though we know Riza had a history of domestic violence and jealous, controlling behavior, Hatice did pay a visit to the Turkish consulate and purchased a plane ticket, so it appears she still had plans to travel to Turkey and meet Riza's family with the intention of marrying him. So what drove him to kill her before she left? Well, Riza apparently told Hatice that he was separated from his wife and planning a divorce. She may have found out this was not true, or that Riza had changed his mind, so he killed Hatice to prevent Winsome from finding out about his extramarital affair. During his final phone conversation with Constable Demirden, Riza claimed that Hatice had been cheating on him, though no evidence has ever been found to substantiate this. It's interesting how Riza also said, quote, "You're Turkish too, what would you do?" as it almost seemed like he wanted to confess to something and was hoping that since Demirden was a fellow Turk, he might provide him with validation for his actions. But even if Riza murdered Hatice to cover up his affair, we know that Winsome was alive for at least 1 month afterward, so how did things escalate to the point where he decided to kill her too? Well, once again, we have zero information about Riza and Winsome's marriage, but it would not surprise me if he exhibited the same level of jealous, controlling behavior towards her, and she became a victim of domestic violence. Since Riza still had Hatice's Corolla in his possession after she went missing, this may have been how Winsome figured out he was seeing another woman, and this led to a confrontation which escalated into murder. It was pretty brazen that Riza disposed of Winsome's body at his own place of employment, Express Steel Supply, but given that he was planning to flee the country anyway, it may not have mattered. Surprisingly, it's been reported that police did search the property on multiple occasions without finding anything, before Winsome's body was discovered by some employees several months later, and this may have caused needless delays in the investigation. But I think it's possible that Riza did a far more thorough job of disposing of Hatice's body because at the time, he was hoping to continue living his life in New York. For nearly a year, there was no hard evidence that any crimes had taken place, but everything changed after Winsome's body was found in May of 2010. From what I can tell, the first media coverage about this occurred on May the 12th, but while the original series of articles revealed Winsome's identity and mentioned that she had a husband who was no longer in New York, they did not publicly release his name. But the authorities eventually made a connection between Winsome's death and Hatice's disappearance, and on May the 19th, both the American and Canadian media ran extensive stories about the case. Not only did they publish Riza's name for the first time, but they featured separate photographs of him alongside both Winsome and Hatice, and the whole story and these photos would also be shared by publications from the Turkish media, which revealed that Riza was wanted for questioning, and the authorities were hoping to extradite him back to the United States. And lo and behold, Riza wound up dead on May the 20th, the very next day. So yes, it seems apparent that Riza came to the realization that the walls were closing in on him, and he felt his days were numbered, so he decided to take his own life before he could be arrested. He left behind what appeared to be a suicide note, in which he stated that his decision to become involved with a Canadian woman was the biggest mistake of his life, so on the surface, it appeared that his attempts to live a double life with a wife and secret girlfriend backfired on him and eventually escalated into 2 murders. Of course, Hatice's family are not entirely convinced that Riza's suicide took place, as they believe he may have faked his own death by pushing an entirely different person from that apartment building. Given the lack of materials provided by the Turkish authorities, I can understand the skepticism, but over the past 14 years, no hard evidence has ever been produced to indicate that Riza might still be alive. And when you look at the circumstances of how these events unfolded, it does make perfect sense that Riza would choose to take his own life on that particular date, and this scenario is just a lot more plausible than an elaborate cover-up involving a fake death, which would require the complicity of numerous people. But I can definitely understand why Hatice's family would cling to this fantasy, since Riza may have been the only person who knew the location of her remains. If Riza was still alive somewhere, then he could still face justice for what he did, and increase the chances of Hatice's loved ones bringing her home and receiving conclusive answers about what happened. As of right now, it appears they are trapped in limbo, because while Hatice's remains are likely somewhere on U.S. soil, where could they possibly start looking? Once again, since the American authorities never officially opened up an investigation into Hatice's disappearance, it does not appear that anyone besides the Toronto Police Service is actively looking for her, and they do not have jurisdiction in New York. All they can really do is continue spreading awareness about her case and hope that some new leads might come in, but otherwise, their hands are kind of tied. While I don't think it's any big mystery who the perpetrator was, Riza Cosa remains something of an enigma. Was he someone who just used and abused women for his own personal gain and got rid of them once they outlived their usefulness? Or did he genuinely want to leave his wife for a long-term relationship with Hatice until things went horribly wrong? Since Riza is no longer with us, we may never learn the full truth, but if by chance you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Hatice Corbacioglu, please contact the Toronto Crime Stoppers tip line at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released over 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I actually took a break from my usual true crime content and released another movie-themed episode, this time counting down my top 10 favorite movie villains. In addition, I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode for my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a case from Australia about a missing boat, the 1988 disappearance of the Patinella. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Vanessa M., Colabrisk, Alana M., and Todd W. Thank you all so much for your support. I wanted to remind everyone that in just under 2 months, The Trail Went Cold will be traveling to London to appear on Podcast Row at the CrimeCon UK event, which is taking place at 133 Houndsditch on September the 21st and 22nd. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code to get a 10% discount, so please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COOL24. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is COOL24 for 10% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.